They say a parent's love is unconditional until it's tested by betrayal. When my daughter told me I wasn't invited to her wedding because I was too old-fashioned, something inside me broke. I'd buried my wife, built a quiet life, and spent every penny I had to give Lydia her dream day. What I didn't know then was that my only daughter and her charming fiancé were already planning to erase me from their lives and my bank account. But here's the thing about old men who've been through hell. We learn patience. And when you take everything from a man who's already lost it all, what's left is someone with nothing left to lose. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, family, friend, or lover, then you're going to feel this one. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you believe karma always catches up, hit that like button because this story, it's proof. My name's Daniel Carter. I'm 62, a retired architect from a quiet corner of Oregon. Most days, my world used to be simple. Black coffee, the sound of rain on cedar, and sketches of houses I'd never build. I'd lost my wife, Elaine, to cancer 7 years ago. And since then, my daughter Lydia was my only reason to keep moving. Lydia was the kind of girl who used to draw beside me while I worked. She'd say, "Dad, one day I'll build a house prettier than yours." I believed her. I believed in her more than I believed in myself. But people change. Or maybe they just reveal themselves when money and status enter the picture. Lydia met Evan Brooks at some startup gala in Portland, a tech executive 10 years older than her, dressed like he lived inside a fashion magazine. At first, I was happy for her. I remember the night she brought him to dinner. He extended a hand that felt like glass, cold, polished, breakable. "Mr. Carter," he said with that perfect white smile, "your daughter is the most extraordinary woman I've ever met." But his eyes, they didn't match his words. They were scanning the room, the furniture, the painting of my late wife above the fireplace. It wasn't admiration, it was evaluation. I saw it then, but didn't name it. Because a father wants to believe his daughter has found someone good. The months passed, and Lydia began to change. Her voice softened into politeness when she talked to me, like I was a client instead of her father. She'd cancel our dinners saying, "Evan's introducing me to investors," or "Dad, I'm busy with the wedding plans." When she finally called one evening to talk about the wedding, my heart lit up until she said the words that would echo for the rest of my life. "Dad, Evan and I decided to keep the guest list small, just people who fit the vibe." "The vibe?" I repeated, trying to laugh. "Lydia, I'm your father." There was silence. Then she sighed. "You're too old-fashioned, Dad. You'd embarrass Evan in front of his family. They're sophisticated people." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It felt like my lungs forgot how. I swallowed the lump in my throat and said quietly, "You want me to stay home from my own daughter's wedding?" "Please don't make this harder than it is," she said. "You've done enough already." And just like that, the call ended. I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the old wedding photo of Elaine and me. Her smile felt like a ghost's hand on my shoulder, gentle but fading. On the day of her wedding, I didn't go. I didn't even know where it was held. I just sat by the window, dressed in the suit I'd worn to Elaine's funeral, and tried to make sense of how love could curdle into humiliation. I told myself maybe I deserved it. Maybe I'd failed her somewhere along the way. But that illusion shattered weeks later, when my phone buzzed with a bank alert. $480,000 withdrawn. My retirement, my entire savings, gone. I stared at the screen, thinking it had to be a mistake. Then I saw the note attached. Transferred to Blue Shore Events, LLC. It was the same wedding planner company Lydia had mentioned. My hands trembled as I called her. Lydia, there's money missing. Nearly $500,000. It's gone. Her voice was calm, too calm. Dad, I told you I'd manage the wedding funds temporarily. It's fine. I'll handle it. Handle it? I snapped. That was my life savings. Don't be dramatic, she said coldly. You said you wanted to help. I thought you meant it. Then she hung up. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk, scrolling through transactions, feeling my pulse throb in my temple. Every dollar I'd earned, every hour I'd spent sketching blueprints long after midnight. All of it drained. That was the first time in my life I truly hated someone I loved. But what I didn't know then, what I was about to uncover, would make losing that money feel like the smallest of betrayals, because Lydia and Evan weren't just stealing my savings. They were planning to erase me from my own life. The following morning, I drove to the bank in person. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The clerk, a young man with a polite but distant smile, typed for a few minutes, then frowned. Mr. Carter, the transaction was authorized under your name. Digital signature verified. My name? I whispered. I didn't sign anything. He turned the monitor slightly toward me. There it was, my own signature, except it wasn't. The curve of the D was too sharp, the loop on the C too perfect. My real signature carried tremor marks from decades of drafting by hand. Can you tell me who initiated the transfer? I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. He hesitated. Blue Shore Events, LLC? Same IP address as a previous login on your online account? That was the moment the pieces started falling into place. The wedding planner company. Lydia's insistence on handling the funds. Evan's too slick confidence. I thanked the clerk, stepped outside, and sat in my car. Rain began to fall, thin lines tracing down the windshield like tears. I just stared ahead, whispering to no one. She wouldn't do this. She wouldn't. But she had. That night, I dug through old emails, invoices, and messages. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every temporary management of funds, it all pointed to Evan. I found the email thread Lydia had sent me weeks before the wedding. Dad, this is the planner Evan works with. Blue Shore Events. Just wire the funds there, and they'll handle everything. And like a fool, I had trusted her. For days, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My life became a loop of regret and rage. Every creak of the house sounded like Elaine's ghost pacing, disappointed that I'd let our daughter fall into such greed. I tried calling Lydia again. No answer. Then a text popped up hours later. Lydia, Dad, please stop calling. Evan's under a lot of stress at work. We'll talk when things calm down. I stared at that message for a long time before deleting it. 2 nights later, I found myself at Elaine's grave, talking to her the way I hadn't since she passed. I don't know what I did wrong, honey, I said softly. I raised her to be kind. To be honest, she used to cry when she found an injured bird. Now she's... this. The cold air carried no answer, only silence. I pressed my palm against the gravestone and made a quiet promise. If she and that man stole from me, I'll make sure they never do it to anyone else. I wasn't a tech guy, but I was methodical. Architects have to be. I started by searching Blue Shore Events LLC. It wasn't a wedding planner. It was a shell company, registered just 6 months ago. The listed address? A rented office in downtown Portland that didn't even exist anymore. The company had no social media, no reviews, nothing. Just a digital ghost. That's when I called Paul Dwyer, the attorney who'd helped Elaine with her estate years ago. He'd always liked me. Said Elaine was the sharpest client he'd ever met. When he picked up, I could barely get the words out. "Paul, I think my daughter's husband stole nearly $500,000 from me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel, come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring every document you have." Paul was the kind of man who didn't waste time with sympathy. He listened, took notes, and pulled up records faster than I thought possible. After 20 minutes of cross-referencing filings, he turned the monitor toward me. "There it is," he said grimly. "Blue Shore Events was created by a man named Evan Brooks. He listed himself as manager and primary shareholder. But look at this. Your name is also listed as a silent partner." I blinked. "What? I've never signed anything like that." He gave a slow nod. "Which means he forged your consent to open it. That also explains how he could legally access your funds." It felt like a knife twisting deeper with every revelation. Paul leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Daniel, this isn't just theft. It's fraud on multiple levels. We can build a case, but it'll take time. And you'll have to be prepared for what happens when we confront them." "I've already lost everything that mattered," I said quietly. "I just want the truth." A week passed before I called Lydia again. I needed to hear her voice, to give her a chance, just one, to tell me it wasn't true. She picked up this time, her tone wary. "Dad, what is it?" "I know about Blue Shore," I said. "I know Evan used it to steal my savings." The silence on the other end was thick enough to choke on. Finally, she whispered, "Dad, I didn't know." "Don't lie to me, Lydia." Her voice cracked. "Please, you don't understand. Evan said he was just investing the money for us, to help us start our life. He said you'd approve if you trusted him." "Trusted him?" My voice rose despite myself. "He forged my signature. You let him rob me, Lydia." She started crying, but her sobs sounded rehearsed. "Dad, I'm sorry, I swear." And then, faintly in the background, I heard Evan's voice. "Hang up, Lydia." The line went dead. That was the moment I knew she was gone, not physically, but morally. My little girl had traded her soul for luxury. The following week, Paul and I filed a report with financial crimes investigators. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice. But before anything could move forward, something even darker surfaced. Paul called me one evening, his voice low and urgent. "Daniel, you need to see this." He sent me a set of forwarded emails recovered from a shared account Lydia had accidentally linked to her old inbox. They were between her and Evan. Evan: "Once the house sells, we'll move everything offshore. The old man won't know until it's done." Lydia: "He's sentimental about that lake house. I'll talk him into signing the deed somehow." Evan: "Good. Play the grieving daughter card if you have to." The lake house, Elaine's sanctuary, the place where she and I spent summers sketching plans for our retirement home. They were planning to sell it, without my consent. The room started spinning. My chest tightened, pain radiating up my arm. The next thing I remember was waking up to the sterile beeping of a heart monitor. I was in the hospital, tubes in my arm, oxygen in my nose. A nurse named Angela was adjusting the IV line when she noticed I was awake. "Easy there, Mr. Carter." "You had a mild heart attack," she said gently. "You're lucky your neighbor found you when he did." I nodded weakly, my mind already spiraling. And then, because fate has a cruel sense of timing, they walked in. Lydia and Evan. She was holding a folder. Evan was wearing that same polished smile that used to fool me. "Dad," Lydia said softly, "you scared us." I didn't respond. Evan stepped closer. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of. We brought some paperwork for the hospital, standard power of attorney forms, just to make sure we can help with your recovery." He slid the papers onto my lap. Something about his voice made my skin crawl. I picked up the top page. The language wasn't standard. It was complete legal surrender, granting them control over my accounts, properties, medical decisions, everything. I looked up at Lydia. Her eyes darted away. Then I caught a flicker of movement behind them. Angela, standing by the door, her eyes narrowing as she listened. "Get out," I said hoarsely. Evan chuckled. "Come on, Daniel. Don't be stubborn. We're family." I said, "Get out." My voice was loud enough that Angela stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" Evan turned toward her, annoyance flashing in his eyes. "We're handling private family matters." But Angela didn't back down. "I'll need to see those documents." He hesitated, then scoffed. "You don't have the authority." "I do," she interrupted. "Hospital policy. Please hand them over." Evan's jaw tightened, but he reluctantly passed the papers to her. She glanced over them, her expression darkening. "I'm calling security," she said quietly. "These aren't valid. The patient hasn't been declared incapacitated, and these signatures look suspicious." Within minutes, 2 security officers arrived. Evan tried to protest, but the nurse's report was enough to have them escorted out. Lydia looked back once, tears glistening, but there was fear in them, not remorse. As they disappeared down the hall, I felt something inside me shift. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just broken. I was angry enough to fight back. They thought I'd die quietly in that hospital bed, that I'd fade into the background while they lived off my life's work. But they forgot one thing. Architects don't destroy. We design. And I was about to design their downfall, brick by brick. They wheeled me out of the hospital a week later, with an oxygen monitor and a stack of discharge papers. The doctor's voice was a bland hum in the background. "Take it easy, Mr. Carter. No heavy lifting. Follow up in 2 weeks." My hands gripped the armrests like the last blueprint I'd ever sign. The world felt fragile, like glass you could shatter with a single misplaced breath. But the most dangerous thing about frailty is how others mistake it for weakness. Lydia and Evan had made that mistake twice now. Once, when they took my money. Twice when they tried to sign me away with forged documents in a room full of beeping machines. They believed their polished smoke and mirrors would hide the smell of rot underneath. They were wrong. When I returned home, the house felt emptier than the day Elaine left it. Her knitting basket still sat by the window. The same cushion she used was dented with memory. I set the oxygen monitor on the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The screen lit my face like a spotlight. This time, I wasn't going to plead or beg. I was going to be methodical. Architects think in plans and contingencies. We map loads and counterloads. We study the dangers before we build. I designed buildings to withstand wind, rain, earthquakes. I'd faced earthquakes of the heart before. This was no different. I began to draw my plan. Step 1, evidence. Real evidence. Not just emails or bank alerts that could be argued away, but documents so tightly connected that a judge would find it impossible to ignore. Paul agreed. He sat in my living room across from me, legal pads balanced on his knee like a shield. "Lucid, focused," he said, tapping his pen. "You have motive, opportunity, and now a medical incident that ties it together. But the prosecution needs a smoking gun, something that proves Evan engineered the shell company, the forgeries, and the offshore transfers." I nodded. My jaw hurt from clenching. "What do we do?" He drew a line across the page and began listing names: forensic accountant, digital forensics, bank subpoenas, offshore investigators. The words sounded expensive. My throat tightened, but Paul raised a reassuring eyebrow. "There are ways to make them talk, Daniel. You start with the bank and we trace the wire. If we find the offshore trail, we bring in someone specialized. You don't need to be rich to get justice. You need patience, persistence, and proof." Proof. I wanted it like a child wants candy, but proof is earned in cold, boring work. I hired Rita Morales, a forensic accountant Paul recommended, a woman with a reputation for untangling corporate lies the way surgeons untangle scar tissue. Rita smelled faintly of citrus and determination. Her eyes didn't flinch when I told her everything. Instead, she asked for access to my records and the login logs for the Blue Shore transfers. She worked like a detective, and that's what she was. For days, she combed through IP addresses, timestamps, server locations, tiny clinical details that formed a map of movement. She found a pattern. Every large withdrawal had been routed through a VPN service. Then a private server registered under a name that, when traced, pointed back to a shell corporation registered in a state with weak oversight. From there, the money slipped into a chain of accounts that feigned legitimacy. Consulting fees, event sponsorships, until they disappeared offshore. Rita's voice when she told me was flat with professional satisfaction. They tried to create a firewall of plausibility, but they left breadcrumbs. Offshore transfers always do. We can trace it. We'll need subpoenas, and we'll need to freeze assets if possible. I felt both hope and exhaustion. The legal gears began to turn. Paul filed for emergency freezing orders against anything linked to Blue Shore events. The court moved with surprising speed once the evidence was lined up. An investigator from the Financial Crimes Unit called me in for a formal statement. He was younger than me, earnest, with eyes that showed he'd read too many late-night files. He listened without interruption as I laid out the timeline. The dinner where Evan smiled too bright. The message that told me I was too old-fashioned. The bank alert. The emails I'd found in Lydia's linked account. He asked about motives. I had only one: betrayal. But motive alone doesn't convict. Rita dug deeper and produced something that made my chest constrict. A bundle of 911-style logs showing a pattern of logins into my account originating from an IP that correlated to Evan's known devices. Those logins matched times when pornographic vendors and luxury car dealerships logged similar traffic, purchases that evaded registration through decoy accounts. It was the digital fingerprint of a man who treated money like a chessboard, moving pieces to distance himself from the consequences. Then came the most personal, jagged discovery. While tracing metadata on a PDF invoice, Rita discovered that my own handwriting, used to sign death certificates, the mortgage on the lake house, had been digitally scanned, edited, and stitched into a forged signature file. There were micro-variants in the strokes. The slight quiver from years of drafting by hand was smoothed out in the forger's attempt. Whoever had done it had layered and smudged until the forgery looked machine-made. Whoever did that had access to high-end forgery tools, and the arrogance to think no one would notice. I imagined Evan hunched in a high-rise office, fluorescent light etching his cheekbones, with a manila folder labeled Plan A and a second labeled Plausible Denial. I wanted to break that office window with my bare hands, but I didn't. I poured my anger into the plan. While Rita traced the money, I began to gather evidence in ways that were legal but unnerving. I requested every document I could find: property deeds, emails, vendor contracts. I asked the county recorder's office to search for any new filings involving the lake house. I combed the calendars and credit card statements Lydia hadn't thought to unlink from her old email. It was like being a surgeon at the scene of an old fight, searching for the bone fragments that would tell the story of the violence. A breakthrough came when a neighbor called me. I'd barely given him my new number, but he'd recognized Lydia and Evan's car at the lake property a few weeks before the transaction was set to close. He'd seen Lydia taking measurements, scribbling notes. She said she wanted to stage the place to sell it fast, he told me. He sounded apologetic, like a man who'd witnessed a betrayal and regretted not acting sooner. Paul used that statement to secure a temporary injunction on the sale of the lake house. It was a small victory, a legal bandage on a wound, but it kept the place from changing hands while we dug further. Every new piece of evidence became a rivet in the case we were building. We found emails where Evan discussed insurance assessments and tax liabilities in a tone that treated human lives like spreadsheets. He'd recommended moving funds through consulting invoices as a way to legitimize the transfers. Lydia's replies were chilling in their casualness. Little sentences like, "I'll handle Dad. He's sentimental. He'll sign anything." I replayed her voice in my head, the same voice that once read bedtime stories, and tried to understand where she had gone. I never found a single answer that wasn't a question in the end. People like Lydia, who tiptoe into corruption, often do it not from venom, but from a quiet, corrosive denial. It erodes your sense of yourself until you wake up and don't recognize the person in the mirror. During those weeks, I had bad days. Days when the chest pain returned as a reminder that the body always betrays the mind first. I learned to manage the panic. I practiced breathing techniques. I walked in the garden where Elaine used to plant lavender because the smell calmed me. The nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, pulse drumming, thinking of the wedding hall I hadn't attended, of the photograph of Lydia as a child in my wallet, her gap-toothed grin like a promise that had been broken. When the investigators asked for permission to access my phone records and email accounts, I didn't flinch. I gave them everything. In return, they gave me a new kind of vigilance. Agents began asking me questions that felt like they were unpeeling me. Who else knew about the savings? Did anyone see you make the transfer? Have you had any previous disputes with Lydia? The questions were clinical, but each one cut. It was during one of those interviews that Paul handed me a printed list with a name circled at the bottom. "You need to talk to Joan Mercer," he said. "She used to work as a compliance officer for a bank Evans' company used. She left under unclear circumstances. If she's willing to speak, she might have direct knowledge about Evans' methods." Joan was in her late 50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved of granite. She met me at a cafe that smelled like fresh bread and coffee stains. When I explained what had happened, she didn't gasp or cry. She reached into her bag and took out a small file of her own, printed emails, a ledger with highlighted entries. Her tone was flat as concrete. Evan used a web of companies to route money. He preferred intermediaries who didn't ask questions, she said. When I raised concerns, I was told to let things flow. When I persisted, my supervisor reassigned me. I left before things got worse. Her testimony became another nail. She described a pattern: vendors that existed only on paper, invoices that doubled in amount, approvals signed digitally by people who'd never seen the paperwork. She said quietly, "He's not just greedy, he's careful. That's the worst part. He plans it so it looks like banking. You don't notice until it's a nightmare." I wanted to tell Joan how grateful I was, but words felt thin. Instead, I asked, "Do you think Lydia knew?" Joan's eyes softened. People like Evan are persuasive. They charm, they isolate. But if Lydia was cooperating, you'll find evidence. If she was manipulated, you'll still find emails or messages that show hesitation. No one who's complicit is thorough enough to erase doubt completely. Her words lingered like a ghost. The weeks turned into months. Court hearings, subpoenas, depositions. The legal process creaked forward like an enormous machine. Each small victory felt like a victory for Elaine's memory. Each delay felt like time Evan used to adjust his cover. At night, when insomnia took me, I found myself sketching, not houses this time, but scenes. I drew the wedding hall from the photograph I'd found online, chairs in perfect rows, a chandelier that glinted with other people's promises. I drew Evan's face again and again, each sketch stripping him of charm and exposing a more honest, sallow man underneath. Drawing calmed me. It was how I thought. Lines turned into logic. And then, in a depositions hearing, a slip that changed everything. Evan had been scheduled to speak via video link. He chose to represent himself with that same brittle smile, his posture too straight as if he'd been laser cut. The prosecutor's voice was steady, precise. He asked Evan about Blue Shore Events, who set up the LLC, who authorized transfers. Evan's answers were rehearsed. "I am an investor," he said. "I had a legitimate business arrangement to help finance Lydia's wedding." He paused, choosing each word. Mr. Carter was fully aware. That was the line Paul had prepared for. He presented a subpoenaed bank log that showed Evan's IP address associated with the Blue Shore account on dates that matched withdrawals. Evan tried to laugh it off, but his fingers betrayed him. They tapped the table in a jittery Morse code of nerves. Then the prosecutor produced an unrelated invoice with a header that matched the PDF Rita had analyzed. It bore Evan's notary stamp, a stamp registered to his office. But the signature looked eerily like mine. Evan's jaw tightened. "Those signatures are similar," he said, clearly searching for a word that would absolve him. And then he made a fatal mistake. He looked down at his phone for a full 2 seconds longer than necessary. One of the investigators noticed. The phone was seized. The next day, the forensic team extracted a text thread with a draft message Ethan, an assistant, as it turned out, had drafted to Evan saying, "For the signature file, combine Daniel C. sig.png with Elaine scan, smooth tremor, use layer mask 4. The file name was exactly what Rita had found. The language was unmistakable. Instructions to fabricate. The courtroom murmured. Lydia's face on the small video tile went white and then ashen. She put a hand to her mouth and began to cry, not the raw, bewildered kind of cry I'd once known, but the kind of crying practiced by those who realize the stairs beneath them are collapsing. It was the single moment when the smoke cleared and the air tasted sharp with truth. That night, I lay on the couch and let the adrenaline drain. There was relief. Yes, a physical loosening around my chest like a band unbuttoning. But relief was a hollow thing without consequence. I wanted more than an admittance. I wanted restitution. I wanted them forced to see the weight of what they'd taken. Paul was relentless. "We'll push for asset freezes and a criminal indictment," he said. "But you need to be prepared for a fight. Evan's well connected. Expect smear attempts. He'll try to paint you as a senile old man who mismanaged his affairs." The thought made bile rise in my throat. I had always been proud of my clarity. I'd designed houses with precise measurements at 50. I could still draw a straight line with my eyes closed. I would not be painted as weak. So I planned. Not a plan of malice, not violent fantasies of retribution. I wanted to use the same instruments Evan had used to harm me: the law, the truth, and the court of public opinion. I would construct a case so airtight that even his silver tongue would be useless. I would make his world small and transparent. I asked Rita to produce a timeline, a neat sequence of dates, times, amounts, and connections. She made charts and flow diagrams, sterile and beautiful. I memorized them. Each arrow on those diagrams was a betrayal, and I traced them with my finger, like an architect tracing faults on a blueprint. Next, Paul suggested a press release. Let the public know what happened, discreetly. You don't want to scream it from the rooftops, but the court of public opinion can pressure institutions to act. I wrestled with the idea. I had never wanted my private life to be fodder for the news. But I also understood the power of exposure. Evan relied on image. He depended on being seen as respectable. Expose the rot and the gloss peels away. We crafted the release with care. It focused on facts: the frozen accounts, the stolen funds, the injunction on the lake house. It avoided sensationalism but held space for righteous anger. Paul circulated it to a small circle of reporters who specialized in corruption and white-collar crime. The response was immediate. Within 48 hours, the story was picked up by a local paper, then a tech blog, and suddenly there were headlines that paired Evan's polished image with the word fraud. I felt a mixture of vindication and a peculiar discomfort. Lydia was my daughter. Watching her see her name in print, coupled with Ethan's and mine, felt like exacerbating a wound. But I also knew that shame is a powerful clarifier. If she'd been manipulated, the clear light of exposure might be the only thing powerful enough to free her. If she'd been complicit, then she had to understand the cost. As public pressure mounted, Evan reacted like a man whose poker hand had shown its cards. He started with denials and then, predictably, a smear campaign. Anonymous posts popped up attacking my character. I was senile, financially irresponsible, too emotional. They dredged up old blog comments I'd made years ago about the dignity of architecture and twisted them into mockery. For a while, the toxicity stung. I'd prefer truth to gossip, but there's always a cost to cleaning a mess that was meant to stay hidden. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the rain tattoo the glass, Lydia called. Her voice was small. "Dad, can we talk?" I felt my resolve shake for a second and then steady. "Come by tomorrow morning," I said. "Bring the truth with you." She arrived late, hair in a messy bun, eyes red. She kept clasping her hands as if to still a tremor. When she walked in, she looked like a kid who'd finally been caught with her hand in the cookie jar. Not because she feared the theft, but because the dessert tasted less sweet than she'd imagined. "Dad," she said, voice breaking, "I didn't know how bad it was. Evan said—" "You didn't know?" I echoed. "You texted him about selling the lake house. You told him to play the grieving daughter." My voice didn't rise, but it was steady enough to cut. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I thought we were going to use the money to start a life. I didn't think he'd go that far." Did you ever think of me? I asked. Of my life savings? Of Elaine's house? She shook her head. Of course I did. I thought you'd understand we needed help. I didn't think he'd do something illegal. That's the point, Lydia. He didn't need you to sign on the dotted line. He needed you to trust him. I could see the realization wash over her. She had been a part of the scaffolding. Whether by fear or greed, she'd served his construction. She reached for my hand, but I pulled it back gently. I loved you, I said, softer now. I thought I raised you to be kinder than this. Her sobs turned into a sound I'd never wanted to hear. The sound of a person unraveling. I felt a little of the old tenderness for her, but it was thin, like gauze. She had choices she made. She stayed for an hour, speaking in staccato confessions. She described how Evan charmed her parents at parties, how he ridiculed my old-fashioned tastes behind closed doors, how he'd shown her spreadsheets with projections and told her they'd be comfortable forever. She told me she'd been scared of losing him. When she left, I sat in the kitchen and let the silence bloom. Her footsteps on the porch faded. The house felt empty in a different way now, like a room cleared of furniture after a storm. I kept thinking of Joan's words. Charm isolates. That's what had happened. Charm had removed me from Lydia's orbit. But charm doesn't create evidence. Smug smiles don't create bank records. They can't hide a paper trail. By the time the indictment came down, I was both calm and wired. The courtroom was packed on the day they read the charges. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy. Prosecutors presented the mapped transfers, the forged signature metadata, and the text messages instructing forgery. Lydia's involvement was categorized as complicity, though the prosecutors exercised discretion with her role in exchange for cooperation. She would be compelled to testify. It felt like the last link snapping into place. Evan sat upright, his face a theater of controlled outrage. He mouthed words at his attorney. I watched him through a slit of calm, thinking of the man he'd been, forceful, ruthless, smooth. He must have felt invincible for a long time. Now the walls were closing in. The judge's gavel came down and the world shifted. Assets were frozen on an emergency basis. The injunction on the lake house remained in place. Restitution was ordered as an interim measure to be discussed later. I left the courthouse that day feeling hollow and strangely buoyant. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in months, I had the terrible, sweet certainty that the truth would not be buried. That certainty is a strange thing. It lets you sleep. It gives you new edges. The revenge I wanted wasn't about retribution as much as it was about restoration, returning what had been taken, restoring my dignity, and making sure the couple who thought they'd engineered the perfect theft would feel the legal and social consequences. I spent the weeks before the trial rehearsing not for theatrics, but for presence. I learned to let the prosecutor speak for me. I chose not to go for spectacle. I wanted clarity. Each time I read Rita's charts, I felt something like pride. She had done her work with the clinical precision of an artist. The diagrams were my blueprints for justice. At night, when the house was quiet and the waves of memory rolled in, I found myself whispering to Elaine at the photo on the mantel. "We'll be okay," I'd say, though the truth was uncertain. I could feel the weight of what I'd lost. There was a hollow I didn't know how to fill. But I also felt the beginning of something else. A small, stubborn flame of dignity. They had tried to erase me. Instead, they had awakened me. They thought the law would finish them. They thought the freezing of accounts would be the end. But legal victories are often only the prelude. What comes after the courtroom is where reputations implode, where people are judged by more than evidence. I had one more design to lay down, a careful, deliberate execution that would expose everything in a way no judge's papers could fully capture. They would feel it in their bones. They thought the law would finish them. They thought the freezing of accounts would be the end. But legal victories are often only the prelude. What comes after the courtroom is where reputations implode, where people are judged by more than evidence. I had one more design to lay down, a careful, deliberate execution that would expose everything in a way no judge's papers could fully capture. They would feel it in their bones. The courtroom smelled like old wood and paper, a familiar perfume to anyone who's spent years drafting briefs and contracts. But it was different this time. The room crackled, not with legalese, but with a hunger for spectacle. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready. The tech blogs had sent people with cameras. People with sympathy for the underdog had started following the case online. Strangers had written to me with words of encouragement. The human chorus was growing, and I intended to let it swell. The prosecution's case was surgical. Rita's charts were presented as exhibits, clinical, beautiful, unyielding. The forensic analyst explained the layered PDF files, the mask layers used to smooth my trembling signature, the VPN routes that masked Evan's IP. Joan's testimony about corporate evasions cut into Evan's posture like an auger bit. The evidence was so tight it made a sound like a snapped wire. Evan took the stand with that same carefully curated armor. But armor only protects so long as it's not dented. Cross-examination peeled his layers away slowly. He stammered when asked about the invoices that paid for bespoke watches and winter trips. He flushed when confronted with a ledger that showed transfers to a Cayman account named for a shell corporation that existed only 6 months and had a registered address in a mailbox facility. His hands trembled. His smile cracked. I sat in the gallery and watched, a spectator to the man who had eaten my life savings like a meal and expected praise for his appetite. My heartbeat was steady. The cardiologist's pills did their work. The anger that had been coiled inside me for months had become something else, a quiet, implacable clarity. The emotional pivot came when Lydia took the stand. She was pale, thinner than I remembered. She set her hands on the lectern as if steadying herself. For a moment she stared at me directly, eyes rimmed red, shame exposed like raw linen. The court fell quiet enough to hear a pin hit the carpet. "Mr. Carter," the prosecutor asked gently, "what was your relationship with your father like growing up?" She swallowed. "He was my anchor. My dad built the house I grew up in. He loved us. Her voice broke. He never deserved this." The questions moved from memory to truth. The prosecutor produced the text messages and emails. The timestamps mapped Lydia's gradual involvement. There were moments of hesitation she had typed. "I don't know about this," flanked by replies from Evan that coaxed, instructed, and eventually directed. With each exchange, her initial denials melted into admissions. "I was scared," she said plainly. "I thought if I didn't go along, I'd lose him. I didn't think he would go as far as forging signatures. I wasn't part of the forgeries, but I didn't stop him. I should have." Her voice had no performance in it. It was a confession. For a second, I felt the old impulse surge forward, to shout, to throw the papers in front of me, to demand the daughter I once had. Instead, I focused on the feeling that had kept me going, that truth matters. That acknowledgement, even belated, matters. The jury returned in the late afternoon. I remember the clack of the door as if an enormous mechanism closed, and the whole world narrowed to a horizon of hushed breath. The forewoman stood. The words came slow. On the counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty. Evan stared for a second as if someone had told him the lights would go out. The judge's gavel sounded like an old metronome marking the end of a long, awful movement. Then orders were read. Restitution, asset freezes to remain, and a sentencing date to follow. The courtroom erupted quietly. Relief is often a private thing clothed in public. Outside, cameras flashed like gulls. Reporters shouted questions I didn't answer. I felt the press of strangers' hands as some offered condolences, others congratulations. I walked out into the day with the sunlight sharp and honest, like an expert's level line. People stopped me. Neighbors I hadn't seen in years. A woman who remembered my classes at the community center. A man who'd once taken my advice about renovating an old farmhouse. They told me they'd followed the case. Some thanked me for standing up. The worst part was the look Lydia gave me as we left. It was complicated. Grief, regret, a childlike ache. She mouthed something that could have been, "I'm sorry," or "I don't know how." I didn't hear it. The sound of the ocean was in my ears, and for the first time in months my breath didn't feel like it had been dragged through broken glass. Rebuilding began with small, practical steps. The court ordered restitution, but those things take time. Frozen assets stay tied up in legal knots. The offshore accounts needed international cooperation to unfreeze. Still, the prosecutors had done their part. They'd cut off the rose-colored light Evan had used to charm others. His industry contacts retreated. Board seats he'd held were resigned. The tech world that prized reputation treated him like a brand crumbling before a scandal. For Lydia, the fallout was brutal. She was summoned to testify again, to cooperate. The prosecutors offered leniency in exchange for full disclosure. She worked with them, and that cooperation shortened the sentence she might have faced for a full-fledged conspiracy role. Later, people called what she did turning state's evidence. In quieter terms, it was a torn life. She contacted me periodically, sometimes with updates on meetings with counselors or jail visits she attended to provide testimony. My own life shifted course. The lake house, once threatened by sale, stayed in my name by court order. But the place felt too steeped in memory for me to remain. I had loved it, had built that memory with Elaine. I decided to sell it, but not to anyone who'd profit from the story. I worked with Paul to find a buyer who would respect it, a nonprofit that preserved the land for community retreats. It felt right. It meant money would circle back in a way that felt less like currency and more like reparation. Selling the house freed me from the past and provided a cushion that replaced, though could never fully restore, what I'd lost. The money allowed me to close chapters. I moved to a coastal town further north, a place where the sea kept constant time and gulls provided an honest, unadorned music. I found a small cottage with a porch that looked out over a harbor. The sound of the water rewired something in me. The city's bright claustrophobia was replaced by a horizon I could measure with my eye. In the weeks after the trial, strangers continued to write. Some offered small kindnesses. A neighbor who dropped off jars of soup. A young architecture student who sent a note about how my old writings on humane design had influenced him. I began mentoring again. The student sat cross-legged on my porch, asking questions about proportion, balance, the ethics of design. Teaching felt like a way back to myself. It reminded me I'd been useful before the betrayal. I could be useful again. There were hard days. The ache of Lydia's absence, not physically absent so much as morally estranged, remained. I missed the casual way she used to hum while she did dishes. I missed the sight of her trying on absurd hats at a fair and laughing until she cried. Those moments aren't replaced. They're archived. Sometimes I walk down to the harbor and let the ache settle like a stone at the bottom of my chest. Then I'd return to the cottage and draw. My new life had no room for the people who'd hurt me, but I also learned a strange new mercy, the ability to separate the person from the act. Lydia had transgressed, yes, but she was also human, broken and fumbling. I didn't want vengeance for vengeance's sake. I wanted a life where dignity could be intact. Months turned into a year. Evan's sentencing was severe, but not the thing I remember most. What I remember is the moment his face was published in the paper, his eyes hollowed, his charm stripped like wallpaper. He called me once from a payphone in detention, voice rough, trying to say something that might be an apology. I hung up without listening. I had no desire for the sound of contrition that arrives when the music stops. It is often thin and smells of convenience. Lydia tried to rebuild herself in small, awkward ways. She volunteered with community services, trying to step out of the shadow of scandal. We spoke a handful of times on the phone about logistics and paperwork. She asked about the lake house sale and about Elaine's papers. Practical things. Once she sent me a photo of a small sculpture she'd made in therapy. 2 small hands clasped together, made of clay and glazed imperfectly. She wrote, "I'm learning to craft steadier hands. I kept the picture in a drawer and looked at it when grief came too sharp. The human heart is resilient but slow. The legal victory returned my name to a ledger. The social reckoning returned a measure of dignity. But the deeper restoration came from small rituals. Teaching a student how to measure a door frame, making soup for a new neighbor, walking the beach at dawn with a thermos of coffee. In these acts, I rebuilt a life that didn't depend on being recognized by my blood." One autumn afternoon, a group of young architects arranged a small exhibition of community projects in the local hall. They dedicated a bench outside the senior center to my late wife, Elaine, with a brass plaque that read, "In gratitude for a life that taught beauty and kindness." I sat on that bench with the wind at my back and let the message sink in. Justice had been served on paper. Life's gentler restorations were still in progress. For all the cruelty that had happened, there had also been kindness, and the kindness was louder than the theft had been. Justice, I learned, is not a single event. It is a series of choices. The court did what courts do. It weighed evidence, assigned guilt, and punished wrongdoing. But justice, for me, was also reclaiming my quiet days, reclaiming the steady work of teaching, and choosing to let the sea smooth the edges of my grief. There's a peculiar dignity in being betrayed and surviving. It is not the loud, cinematic revenge people crave. It is quieter. A man who wakes up and draws, who listens to a student finally understand proportion, who walks past the pictures that used to make his chest ache and breathes anyway. I kept my head up. I let the law do its work and then did mine, living carefully, honestly, and with a new caution I called wisdom. If there's a moral here, it's this. People who think they can erase you by stealing your savings often forget one human truth. Dignity is not wholly financial. It's built over years with small, stubborn acts of integrity. They can try to steal what you own, but they cannot steal the way you choose to respond. If this story moved you, please Please like the video and subscribe. It helps me bring stories of truth and justice to more people. Comment below with your city and time. I read everyone. And tell me, have you ever had someone close betray you? What did you do next? Your story might help someone else find their footing. Thank you for listening. Keep your dignity close and remember, class never goes out of fashion.